If we go back a decade, McLaren were having an absolute nightmare. In 2015, they reunited with Honda, hoping to rekindle some of their iconic success with drivers like Senna and Prost, but instead, the team fell further than anyone could have predicted. In that season, they scored just 27 points, finishing 9th in the championship, and only ahead of the Marussia team, who went bankrupt the following season. The once great team had become a shadow of its former self, but fast forward a decade later, and in 2024 they won their first Constructors' title in 26 years. They re-established themselves as undoubtedly a top team in Formula 1, and now on the eve of the 2025 season, they are the favourites for both the drivers and Constructors' titles. This is the story of how an F1 icon was rebuilt from the pits of embarrassment. Before we get into this video, however, I want to say a quick word about the sponsor of today's video, CyberGhost VPN. 38 million people trust CyberGhost to help them connect them to servers all around the world that allows them to access geo-blocked content that is being taken away from you. So for example, when I was on holiday in Japan last year and wanted to keep up with all of my favourite shows that I was watching, I found out that most of them had been blocked outside of the UK. Using CyberGhost, in just a few clicks you can unblock all of the videos and TV shows that you want to watch on sites like YouTube, Amazon Prime, Netflix and others that are being geo-blocked from anywhere in the world. CyberGhost also protects your data from hackers and data brokers that want to sell your information online. All you need is one CyberGhost account that can be used on up to 7 different devices, and by using my link in the description, you can get 84% off CyberGhost VPN as well as 4 months completely free, and on top of that there is also a 45-day money-back guarantee if you decide to change your mind. So once again, a big thank you to CyberGhost VPN. Ron Dennis at the beginning of the hybrid era famously said that if you want to win the World Championship, you need to be a manufacturer team. Due to this self-imposed pressure, when McLaren and Honda finally announced that they would be reuniting, McLaren actually pressured Honda into entering Formula 1 a year early in 2015, immediately putting them in a difficult situation given that they were a brand new power unit manufacturer. Honda's difficulties were then made even worse by the fact that McLaren also enforced very tricky packaging demands on their new power unit. For aerodynamic opportunities, McLaren had a very slim car that was dubbed a zero-size concept, but this was a challenge that was well beyond what Honda were capable of accomplishing at the time. The consequences to all of this is that the brand new Honda power unit was uncompetitive and underdeveloped compared to the Mercedes and Ferrari, and even worse, it was horrendously unreliable given that McLaren's packaging demands had put enormous strain on the efficiency and cooling of the power unit. In an era where Formula 1 was just starting to clamp down on how many engine components you could have across the entire season, grid penalties for McLaren didn't just become a regular occurrence, they became a running joke in the eyes of the fans and media. It didn't take long for the frustration to boil over. There was a lot of private criticism behind closed doors, and more importantly, Alonso's very public and very damaging comments over the team radio calling their power unit a GP2 engine in Honda's home race in Suzuka. Although Fernando's frustrations are understandable, those comments soured the relationship from very early on. Honda has a very Japanese working culture, and publicly criticizing them over team radio created a rift between the two companies that would only get worse from there on out. In 2016, after a year of development, the performance, reliability and results finally did start to improve. However, for 2017, Honda tried to develop a brand new concept more akin to what Mercedes had at the time with a split turbo design, and this backfired massively. There were numerous reliability issues right from the beginning of preseason testing. The performance regressed, with McLaren scoring just 30 points across the whole season. They continued to take a ridiculous amount of grid penalties, and the whole season was basically encapsulated at the Russian Grand Prix when Alonso's car broke down on the formation lap before the race had even started. By this point, the culture clash and blame game were reaching toxic levels, to the point where it was very obvious that this partnership was now terminal. McLaren, and specifically Alonso, made massive claims in the media that they had a race-winning chassis on their hands in 2017 and that they were being held back entirely by Honda. In September, McLaren formally terminated their contract with Honda, opting to use Renault power from 2018 onwards. Honda would eventually partner up with Red Bull in 2019, who made a point to build a much stronger working culture between their two companies and immediately won races during their first season together. They eventually went on to win 2 constructors and 4 drivers' titles with Max Verstappen, with, ironically, reliability being one of the key strengths of the Honda power unit. As I am recording this video before the start of the 2025 season, the last time that Max Verstappen suffered a race-ending power unit failure was at the 2022 Australian Grand Prix. Honda were by no means blameless in the downfall of McLaren, but their success with Red Bull vindicated that ultimately the majority of the blame was on McLaren and their corporate culture. McLaren needed a proven race-winning power unit, and this is exactly what they got in 2018 with Renault. Rule changes were brought in which banned manufacturer teams from limiting the engine modes that the customer teams could use, meaning that the parity was now a lot better with factory teams. And given that Red Bull won 4 races in 2018 with the Renault power unit, McLaren themselves admitted going into the season that they now had no more excuses. Although they had a strong start, scoring points 8 times in the first 5 races, their season fell off a cliff. They failed to develop their car throughout the year, and their self-proclaimed race-winning chassis was uncompetitive. McLaren in 2018 were humbled. Behind the scenes, there was a massive technical reshuffle, and in the public eye, they had to own the fact that their failure over the last few years was not entirely down to Honda as they tried to make it out. Once McLaren had some stability and actually identified and accepted the real issues with their own chassis, they were finally able to have a resurgence using Renault power. In 2019, they would go on to finish 4th in the Constructors, then followed that up by finishing 3rd in 2020, and also scored 3 podiums along the way with Carlos Sainz and Lando Norris. Renault was always just an interim solution for McLaren, and so that is why for 2021, the team announced that they would be reuniting with Mercedes. Since 2021, the talk about engines has basically become non-existent. They were able to power McLaren to their first win for almost a decade in 2021, and to this day, even though McLaren have not been flawless over the past few years, the Mercedes power unit has never been their limiting factor. When they won the Constructors' title in 2024, it was the first championship for a customer team in 11 years of the hybrid regulations. In a way, it was a full circle moment after what Ron Dennis said about needing to be a manufacturer team to win titles. But to his defense, the landscape and parity between manufacturers and customers is very different in 2025 compared to 2015, and in a way, one championship for a customer team in 11 years of these rules isn't exactly a massive success story. In 2023, Zak Brown did his due diligence and did consider other power units ahead of the new engine rules in 2026, even going so far as to visit the new Red Bull powertrains facility. In the end, continuing with Mercedes, who have proved that they now have a championship-winning power unit, was obvious. And so to maintain the stability and competitiveness inside the team, McLaren extended their contract with Mercedes, signing a new deal that will take them to 2030. I think it's worth saying that a lack of quality drivers has never been McLaren's problem. One of the core values of McLaren throughout their history is that compared to a team like Red Bull, for example, they have never been afraid to put together the 2 absolute best drivers on the grid, regardless of the potential consequences. For 2015, McLaren had Alonso and Button as their driver lineup, and on paper, this is genuinely one of the greatest driver lineups that we have ever seen. However, unfortunately, the uncompetitiveness on track and frustration off track meant that what this actually became is the most wasted driver lineup in Formula 1 history. Jenson Button had no motivation to even want to extend his career for longer than he did, and so he retired at the end of 2016, going on to be replaced by the reigning GP2 champion Stoffel Vandoorne. And now Vandoorne will forever be a really talented driver who simply found himself in the right place but at the wrong time, and he ultimately became a victim of McLaren's transitional period. This was a driver who at the time had a record-breaking championship-winning GP2 season, And when Alonso was injured and on the sidelines for one race, Van Dorn in his place finished in the points on his McLaren debut. He's a driver who I genuinely believe in a different environment might still even be in Formula 1 today. Unfortunately, he got completely engulfed by the McLaren Alonso vortex, and his career never really got off the ground. In 2 seasons alongside Fernando, driving unreliable and uncompetitive cars, and within a team that was going through absolute turmoil, he was totally dominated by Fernando. Alonso himself by 2018 had also had enough. His motivation to stay at McLaren was already beginning to wane, to the point where Zak Brown even allowed Fernando to miss the 2017 Monaco Grand Prix so that he could compete in the Indy 500. Alonso's gamble to leave Ferrari and to be the spearhead for the McLaren-Honda revival had completely backfired. In the process, he dented his reputation, basically lost his love for Formula 1, and even to this day at Aston Martin, he is still basically suffering the repercussions of his move to McLaren in 2015. A common theme throughout this video is that 2019 was the single biggest season that, in my opinion, changed the trajectory of McLaren and took them back onto the path to where they are now. For 2019, McLaren had an all-new driver lineup of Carlos Sainz and a rookie Lando Norris. Now, on paper, they were not better drivers than Fernando, but they were the drivers that McLaren needed to rejuvenate them. Lando and Carlos brought with them a brand new energy and enthusiasm inside of the team that had kind of been lost after years of negativity. Although Carlos was relishing his role as the team leader inside of McLaren, and him and Lando had that incredible Car-Lando relationship that we all loved, when Ferrari came calling, he just simply couldn't refuse. Given how strong that partnership was between him and Lando, I think that there is a very interesting alternative universe where if he doesn't go to Ferrari, he's probably still there at McLaren fighting for titles against Lando. In his place, McLaren picked up Daniel Ricciardo on a massive contract and in his absolute prime in what seemed like at the time a surefire upgrade on Carlos Sainz. Ricciardo would go on to have a nightmare couple of seasons that I don't think anyone saw coming. The McLarens of this era had very specific driving traits that were incompatible with how Ricciardo liked to drive, which not only destroyed his confidence, but made him uncompetitive relative to Lando. Speaking about these unique driving traits, Ricciardo recalled a very interesting interaction that he had with Sainz in 2021, in which he said, "I bumped into Carlos not too long ago. He was like, 'What do you think? Strange, huh?' And I was like, 'Thanks for telling me.'" Even though he did give McLaren their first Grand Prix win in almost 10 years in Monza, his performances and gap relative to Lando, who had now established himself as a potential future world champion, were becoming untenable. When McLaren decided to terminate his contract a year early, this was a situation that could have easily continued to spiral out of control in a similar way to what Red Bull have been going through with their second driver dilemma. Instead, Zak Brown proved just how sharp of a team McLaren had become and quite literally managed to snatch a victory from the jaws of defeat. McLaren needed to find a driver that would bring stability, instant results, and more importantly, long-term success alongside Norris. Signing Oscar Piastri in the way that they did from right under Alpine's nose wasn't just a message of intent about how capable they were of rectifying their own mistakes, but it was also a massive vote of confidence by Oscar in McLaren that they were the right place to be for the future. Zak Brown has not exactly been shy about praising his driver lineup as the best on the Formula 1 grid, and whether you agree with him or not, whilst there are still key areas in which both of the drivers need to improve, they delivered McLaren that Constructors' title in 2024, and looking ahead, even if say Lando decided to leave McLaren, they now have 2 drivers capable of winning the championship, meaning that their driver lineup for the future is basically future-proof in case someone decides to leave. To reiterate his faith in both of his drivers, Zak Brown has not wasted any time in trying to tie them down to long-term contracts. Lando is on a multi-year deal that runs until at least 2026, whilst Oscar has literally just extended even further with McLaren until at least 2028. During the McLaren-Honda years, to say that there was tension and toxicity behind the scenes would be an understatement. Someone was always going to have to take the fall for the failure of this project, and in 2016 it was announced that Ron Dennis, the man who made McLaren the powerhouse that it is today, would sell his shares in the team and leave at the end of the season. Although they tried to dress it up and make it look as amicable as possible out of respect for his contributions to McLaren, Dennis was essentially pushed out of the team. And regardless of what people think, history has proven that it was the best decision that they could have made, because the man that replaced him to run McLaren Racing was Zak Brown. When Zak came in right at the end of 2016 as the executive director, I think it's easy to forget and take for granted just what a mess he was walking into. The McLaren brand was losing credibility by the day, there was political and managerial battles within the team, the Honda situation was just continuing to deteriorate, and the team's financial situation was on the verge of becoming a disaster. It would take a couple of years, but once Zak Brown became the CEO of McLaren Racing and had ultimate control over all of the decision making inside of the team, that is when things really started to change. He effectively overhauled the entire management within the team, injecting it with new blood and a clear structure for the future. His first big decision was ousting Eric Boulier, who officially was the racing director since joining back in 2014, but had basically become the team principal. Rightly or wrongly, Boulier was emblematic of the previous regime under Dennis and represented a lot of the toxicity and blame culture that had engulfed the team. Following Boulier's departure, Zak Brown said, "The causes are systemic and structural, which require major change from within. With today's announcement, we start to address those issues head-on and take the first steps on the road to recovery." In his place, Zak Brown appointed Andreas Seidl as the brand new team principal of McLaren starting in 2019. Seidl had previously been the team principal of the Porsche hypercar team that had just won 3 Le Mans 24-hour races in a row, and this was a major appointment by Zak because it was his first senior leader and the man that he handpicked to lead McLaren. With a new team principal, 2 new drivers, and the baggage of the Honda years behind them, 2019 ushered in a new era of McLaren, and under Seidl, the team finally saw a renaissance. They scored their first podium in Brazil 2019 with Carlos Sainz. Lando wouldn't have to wait too much longer to get his first podium in Austria in 2020, and a year later the team also bagged their first win with a 1-2 in Monza. Seidl was also instrumental in modernizing the team during this period and pushing for a massive overhaul of the infrastructure, with a brand new wind tunnel, driver and loop simulator, and composite facility. Speaking about the need for all of these improvements, he said, "As you can imagine, I'm pushing hard to get these different infrastructure measures in place again as quickly as possible. We all know that this will be key in our journey back to the front in Formula 1, as we have a deficit there compared to the top teams." After a disappointing 2022 season, pressure was beginning to mount on Andreas Seidl, and this coincided with Audi approaching him to be their CEO ahead of their comeback in 2026. It was an offer that Seidl felt he couldn't refuse, and so he was replaced as team principal with an internal promotion of Andreas Stella. Now, Stella has a long history in Formula 1 with an engineering background, starting his career with Ferrari and having worked alongside Schumacher, Raikkonen and Alonso, before joining McLaren in 2015. During this time, he climbed up the ranks, initially being head of race operations in 2015, then performance director in 2018, racing director in 2019, and then becoming team principal in 2023. The advantage that Stella has had, apart from his immense experience in Formula 1, is that because he's been in McLaren right from the beginning of the McLaren-Honda era, he knows exactly where the team has been going wrong on both the technical side and also the managerial side. If there is one thing so far that has defined the stellar reign at McLaren, is that his primary focus has been on restructuring and bolstering the technical team. Just a few months into the job and after a disappointing start to 2023, he dropped James Key as technical director. In his place, he set about creating a new structure with what he called the 3 pillars of car performance, which were aimed at tackling the previous issues of miscommunication and a lack of responsibility of who was in charge of what department and how they contributed to car performance. At the top of the pyramid, you have Rob Marshall, who was acquired from Red Bull as the chief designer, and then you have 3 different technical directors, all with their own specific area of focus. Neil Haldey as the TD of Engineering, Peter Prodromo as TD of Aerodynamics, and Mark Temple as TD of Performance. Speaking of the changes and the need for this kind of non-traditional technical structure, Stella said, "In the structure that we have deployed, we want to have clear leadership in relation to the three fundamental areas to make quick cars in modern Formula One, which are aerodynamics, car concept, and engineering." That's not to say that Stella has got everything right, but similar to how Zak Brown was able to quickly rectify the Ricciardo situation, Stella equally has been very proactive when problems have arisen. When McLaren signed David Sanchez from Ferrari and clearly something just didn't work out, he ended up leaving after only 3 months because he was deemed too senior for the position that he was occupying, and it's that kind of analytical and proactive approach that I think has been the key to the Zak Brown and Andrea Stella era. On top of the technical side, McLaren have also refined the operational side of the team as well. Alongside Red Bull, they are consistently one of the fastest and most efficient pit crews on the grid, and in 2023, they set a Formula 1 pit stop record with a 1.8 second stop. Although they did show signs of inexperience and strategical naivety last year when fighting for the title, they also proved as the season progressed that they could rise to the challenge of fighting with Red Bull and the pressure of fighting for wins and titles consistently. When McLaren hit rock bottom in 2015, it was a period where their greatest weakness was probably their arrogance. Arrogance at the fact that everything was Honda's fault, and arrogance in the fact that they thought that they were better than they actually were. What Zak Brown has done to turn this team around, I think, is nothing short of sensational. He has put the right people in place to manage the team, he has signed and replaced drivers when problems have arisen, and especially on the commercial side, if you just compare the number of sponsors that they had on their car 10 or so years ago compared to now, he has totally transformed the team's commercial power. More than anything else, Zak Brown has changed the perception of McLaren. During the Ron Dennis and McLaren Honda era, it was such a cold and corporate team, whilst now, with the Papaya rebranding, whilst they still are very corporate in a lot of areas, the team has so much more personality, the drivers are able to express themselves a lot better, there is a lot more interaction and engagement with their fans, and in general, it's a team that makes you want to believe that they're going to succeed. 2024 was tangible proof of McLaren's progression. There is still plenty of other challenges ahead with the 2026 rule changes on the horizon, but in the here and now, after more than 10 years, McLaren have finally returned to being genuine and consistent title contenders, and given that they are the favourites for both titles ahead of the start of the 2025 season, they have also now set themselves up perfectly to challenge for championships in the years to come. Well, there you have it. Once again, don't forget to check out the link in the description to get a huge discount on CyberGhost VPN, which also comes with a 45-day money-back guarantee. And once again, a massive thank you to them for sponsoring this video. If you did enjoy this video, then don't forget to subscribe to the channel, that would be massively appreciated, and I'll see you in the next one.